Right, in the first part of chapter 14, we're going to look at checks in more detail. We introduced it when we talked about negotiable instruments in chapter 13. The second part of the chapter, we'll talk about banking in the digital age. So the UCC, which we've learned about, governs checks and electronic fund transfers. We'll talk about checks this time, EFTs next time. Article 3 covers all negotiable instruments, including checks, and Article 4 establishes a framework for deposits, EFTs, and checking agreements between banks and customers. There are different kinds of checks. We've talked generally about checks as a negotiable instrument. There are special checks like cashier's check, where the bank serves as both the drawer and the drawee. The bank assumes responsibility for payment on this type of check. You can look at case 14.1 for an example. Traveler's checks, they have to be signed by the drawer again when cashed. This is to help with security. However, it seems like traveler checks are dwindling, especially with the electronic fund transfers that we'll talk about. Certified checks, a check that has been accepted by the bank in which it is drawn. There are multiple aspects to the bank-customer relationship. One is a creditor-debtor relationship. The bank owes money to the customer, in this case, making them the debtor, and must honor the customer's checks or orders, like we talked about last week. There's also another way of looking at it as an agency relationship. The bank must pay a customer's checks as their agent and collect for customers if she deposits checks. And also another way of looking at it is a contractual relationship. There's an agreement between the parties, the bank and the customer, that is often in writing on paper or electronically. Bank has a duty to honor checks in certain situations. As we said earlier, it's funds that are in the account and they're supposed to follow the customer's orders. And a bank that wrongfully dishonors a customer's check is liable for actual damages only. In terms of overdrafts, a bank has two options. It can dishonor it because there's insufficient funds in the account, or pay the check and charge the customer's account. In some cases, there are overdraft protection agreements, and a wrongful dishonor of a overdraft would be considered a breach of that contract. In terms of post-dated checks, a bank can pay these unless they're notified in time to act on it. Other issues that come up: death or incompetence of the customer, and stale checks. Neither death nor incompetence revokes the bank's authority to pay until it has knowledge, and this can be up to 10 days after death. In terms of stale checks, we're talking about checks more than 6 months old. After 6 months, it's the bank's choice of whether they want to honor the check or not. Stop payment orders. Somebody might issue an order to stop payment on a check. A customer can't stop a certified check and must give the bank sufficient time to act in situations involving stop payments. An oral stop payment order would be for 14 days. A written stop payment order would be for 6 months. Customer may have liability if they wrongfully issue a stop payment order. If they don't have some real or personal defense, then the holder can sue them for non-payment. A bank could have liability for wrongful payment when there is a valid stop payment order, and then they would be required to recredit the customer's account. And the bank would be liable if subsequent checks bounce after that. We briefly talked about unauthorized signatures on negotiable instruments last week, and now this is an example of a check that bears a forged drawer signature. So we're talking about on the front of the negotiable instrument, generally a forged signature and check has no legal effect on the signature of the drawer. But there could be a situation where the customer's negligence contributed to the forgery. If the customer substantially contributes to the forgery, the bank wouldn't be liable. If the bank substantially was negligent, then they're liable. The customer does have an obligation to timely examine bank statements, and their failure to detect forgeries, primarily through those bank statements, can lead to liability. Basically, the customer has 30 days from the detection of the forgery to inform the bank. If the bank is negligent, then they need to recredit the customer's account when they pay on a forged signature. Also, there's the issue of forged endorsements. So on the back of the negotiable instrument, if there's a payment on a forged endorsement, if it's not to the customer's order, then the bank must recredit, unless, again, it was the customer's negligence. Some things that might contribute to that before, as large gaps or incompleteness, or could be negligence after the forgery. The customer needs to notify the bank within 3 days after the forged items made available to customer, or if a series of forgeries within 30 days of the receipt of either the bank statement or canceled checks. So basically there's an obligation for the customer to contact the bank once they become aware of the forgeries, and there's timelines for that. The bank can recover from a person who paid if there's a warranty. The presenter in that case doesn't have good title due to the forged endorsement. Altered checks. Banks have an implied duty to inspect checks. If a customer is negligent, it shifts that loss to the customer if the bank paid in good faith and without notice. And then the bank can go after, if they pay on an altered check, and go back after other parties to recover. Banks also have a duty to accept deposits. They need to publish an availability schedule for deposited checks. We'll talk about that, interest-bearing accounts, and the collection process in general. There is the Expedited Funds Availability Act of '87 and the Fed's Regulation CC. Requires that checks deposited into banks must be available for withdrawal by check or cash within a certain number of days from the date of deposit. If it's a local check, it is 1 business day from the date of deposit. If it's non-local check, then 5 business days from the date of deposit. Deposits made in non-proprietary ATMs, in other words, deposits made into ATMs which are not part of that bank's network, can take 5 business days. And there are some exceptions for new customer deposits and large deposits. When we talk about the traditional collection process, we're talking about the bank collection process under the law, not as it's expedited in electronic funds transfers, which we'll talk about more in the second part of Chapter 14. But there are different banks in the collection process. There's the depository bank, the payor bank, some intermediary banks, and then the collecting bank. There's different processes depending upon whether it's customers of the same bank, because in that situation the bank doesn't have to deal with other outside banks, and a check collection between customers of different banks. The depository bank must present the check to the next intermediary or payor bank before midnight of the next banking day following receipt. The UCC does permit deferred posting bank to set a particular time, for example 2 p.m. as a cutoff hour. And often you would see that at an ATM even, where they would show you the cutoff period. After that hour, items are posted for the next business day. Talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve System. They have a process for clearing checks. Basically, they serve as a clearinghouse where checks and drafts are exchanged and drawn on each other's account. Also, check clearing under the Check 21 Act. It creates a new negotiable instrument called a substitute check, where the original is destroyed. So in the old days, we would actually move the paper around and even provide the original check to the customer. But in this case, the original check is actually destroyed, and then it becomes electronic transaction, or under the Act, a paper reproduction of the front and back of the original check. This helps to reduce float time. In other words, instead of the check actually having to physically move around in the check clearing process, paper can be moved around quicker, print or reproduction of it. And this also allows for faster access time, because the processing time decreases. This float time would be the period of time when you write a check and when the money is actually taken out of your account. And you may have noticed that there's less time between that. So sometimes a check is deposited, and almost it seems like that same day it's pending withdrawal from your account. You also see situations where people scan checks right at the point of sale, and